Tonight on OMI Life, in our last installment with Father Austin Cooper, we continue to hear about his teaching career, his love of history and spirituality, his time as Provincial, and his thoughts on what the future holds for the Oblates.
So 65 years is quite a long journey. We started in Sorrento, we met the Oblates, we went to Ireland for formation, we've returned to Australia, we've done quite a bit of study, helped to start formation in Australia, commenced an amazing academic career, helped to found and founding master of CTC. All of the study was around history, but one of the subjects you lectured me in when I was at university was in spirituality. How did you find yourself lecturing in spirituality?
Oh, a wonderful question. Thank you. If you're going to be a historian, you look at the church and you find that there are three great strands that you've got to keep in mind if you're really going to sort of penetrate to the story of the church in its fullness. And in this I just follow a great Catholic thinker of the early 19th century. First of all, the church is obviously here as an organisation. So people can look at the church just simply as the Catholic Church, which has property, it has a whole lot of buildings, it does a whole lot of things, it has schools, colleges and all the rest of it, hospitals. So you can look at this organisation just simply as an organisation. And you can trace its history, and a lot of people do. A lot of people outside the church and even outside the Christian fold can look at the Catholic Church and be quite amazed at it and indeed quite impressed by it. When you take it, through a long period, you find a lot of great strengths and great weaknesses. As one historian said, the shame and the glory of it all. It's a strange mixture. And one of the people I think who's done this very well was a politician, an English politician. In fact, he was the deputy leader of the Labour Party during the premiership of the man who was Prime Minister at the time was Tony Blair, and his deputy was Roy Hattersley. Roy Hattersley is not a Catholic. I don't know that he's even a believer, but he's written a fascinating history, quite a big one, just simply called The Catholics. And it's tracing the history of the Catholic communities in England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales since the Reformation down to the present time. And look, it really is a very, very interesting read, but it's not by a believer. Now, if one was a believer, one would also want to tell a story in terms of, appreciating and preaching the faith. Because this body, this group of people exists to carry on the mission of Jesus Christ. That's its sole purpose, and everything is summed up in the one in whom all things are being restored, as St. Paul says. So really, the history of the Catholic Church is a history of the way in which Catholics have tried to express their faith in Jesus Christ. So that takes us into the whole realm of all the great controversies in the early church about whether Christ was just simply a human being or whether he was both human and divine, right through all the discussions about, the sacraments, what are the sacraments, how many of them are there, and so on. All these great, issues of theology and doctrine. What really are the theological issues which become clarified as fixtures, as doctrines, as central points? So the second thing about the teaching of history is to teach the history of theology in some way. But there's more than that. We don't only have this organisation teaching who Jesus Christ was, we also say that we can actually replicate his life in ours. That is spirituality. And so it's a great challenge when you come to, say, teach the history of the Catholic Church in my period, for instance, the 19th century, to do justice to just simply the organisation of it. Just take England alone. where for years the Catholic Church was a tiny community of people mostly living in and around the few noble houses which kept the faith, and a few workers here and there in parts of a great city like London, the little pockets of Catholics, even in the great metropolis. And now, from the 1829 onwards, the Catholic Church becomes once again a visible part of English society. So there's a whole sort of development of an organisation with its own politics, its own stresses and strains and all the rest of it. How do you do justice to that, plus all the great theological issues which were taking place? So many converts came into the church, and it's almost as though they didn't want them. You know, they were coming into a totally, out of an Anglican milieu where they were in the national church, into a church which, of its nature, said, don't appear above the parapet, don't be noticed. And here these people, like John Henry Newman and all the rest of them, they were used to debating church issues in public. Mm-hmm. So for a long time, it took a long time to, adjust these newcomers to life in the church. And one could say that to some extent, great public figures like Cardinal Newman and Cardinal Manning remained somewhat outside some aspects of the Catholic theme. It's extraordinary. And yet at the same time, they were also, particularly Newman, was doing such an immense amount to enrich English spirituality. So spirituality deserved, it just didn't get a proper place in the overall teaching of church history. So I decided to hive it off and teach it as a separate thing. So it necessarily, in my hands, it becomes very much a historical thing. The reading of the great classics, that's what it's really all about, and how they still travel across the centuries and can be read today. Well, anybody picking up St Augustine's Confessions, it's still a great read. You know. And look at the number of people who are reading or listening to the music of Hildegard of Bingen, an 11th century abbess in Germany. Well, what a different culture she came from. And yet she can speak to this with her love of nature, her concern about the environment, her spirituality of environmentalism, really. It's got an immense amount to say to us about today. So the great classics, and here once again is the abiding thing of the Catholic thing, seen, I think, really at its best in the spiritual tradition. So, spirituality.
So that's how it all started.
That's how it started, yeah.
Your teaching and your passion for spirituality developed, but during that time you're also appointed or elected by the province and appointed by the Superior General as the Provincial of the Australian province. Each provincial faces different challenges when they take up their term. What characterise your time as Provincial of the Australian province?
Well, you know, in the few years just before my term as Provincial, we had moved into Indonesia. So we still did have a great deal of challenge about, building up that mission, which I think we did in my time. We actually opened a seminary up there. And that meant we had 2 seminaries to supply in a small, province. It was still a comparatively small province, wasn't it? And so we not only had St Mary's, where we, had at one stage 6 on the staff. A couple were one, Bertie Comicon, was retired, but he was still a major contributor simply by just being there as a great presence. And we had someone like John McLaughlin who was studying. So, but that's still, there were 6 of us there. So when we had to open a place as well in Java, that really was a great demand. So there was a concern about the mission and continuing to build up the mission, which was not only with personnel, of course, but also with financial help. So that remained a central piece, mission. But not only that, but mission at home as well. And I think that we did try to do something. We looked around for areas where we could serve in places where there were underprivileged people, and we did find 2. One that we found was North Melbourne, which we didn't stay in for very long, which I thought was a pity. But when we went there, it was a stroke of genius, or a great grace, to nominate for that job John Coakley, who was also my successor as Provincial. John went as parish priest of North Melbourne. Just at that time, the Vietnamese migrants were coming in their boatloads, and John made them welcome. He did an immense amount, because a lot of them were put in housing in the high-rise, apartments in North Melbourne. So what John Coakley did in receiving the Vietnamese migrants was absolutely spot on as regards an oblate mission. For other reasons, a future provincial decided, for good reasons, to move out of that and to move elsewhere. But while we were there, it really was a very significant oblate mission. I also then thought, well, we should go to the far west of Sydney, where, still there's extraordinary underprivileged sort of areas there. So I went to the then Bishop of Parramatta and I said to him, look, could we help in your diocese? He said, well, there are so many people coming here to help that they're sort of falling over one another.
Gosh,
so,
what a different church.
Yes, indeed. So he said, and it was very generous of him, he said, look, I think the people who need help is actually the Diocese of Wollongong. So that's how we went down to what is now Eagle Vale, but that was our first foothold in that diocese, and that has proved, as you know, to be a very worthwhile oblate mission. So those were two missions on the home front. But I think also one of the things that I took under my wing, one of the great things that I've been impressed by in history is the rule of St Benedict, which goes back a long way. But when St Benedict talks about a leader, it's very interesting. He doesn't talk about the abbot as governing. He does, but when he talks about the abbot's role, he says, first of all, the abbot must not teach anything. And when the abbot does this, the first thing he should teach. So teaching he always puts first. So, and I think that any leadership role is a pastoral role of preaching the gospel. And I think that you're doing that in so many ways with all the great programs that you're promoting. I try to do it by letters to the province. And, I think that they were often appreciated. People would often sort of say to me how significant they thought they were. And I thought that they were just one of the things that, were important to do, to see some sort of a teaching role, continuing to hold up the ideals, if you like. And I think that the Provincial has the grace of doing that in a way that nobody else quite has, as a grace of state. So although we're not monastics, we can learn from a great monastic thing that, here in the Benedictine community, the leader is first of all one who tries to inspire. And so I can thank you for, what you do in that regard, because you come out of the education thing too very, very strongly. So that was one of the things that I think another thing that I tried to do was to make sure that I actually talked to each oblate. But you can't do this because the Premier of Victoria says you can't go more than 10 kilometres. In my day, the
10 kilometres today.
In my day, the Premiers of Victoria were a very liberal lot, and they let us roam around all over the country. So I made sure that I went to every oblate house every year, and that I tried to sit down and talk to each oblate individually. My predecessor had been a great social being, John Hannah. There was none like him. Nobody had the grace of drawing people together like John Hannah had. And I think that John often used to go into a community to be the life and soul of the party, and it was marvellous. They loved having him. I often wondered whether he actually sat down and talked to each one. I don't know, he might have. If he would have been inspiration. But I felt that my strength, I couldn't be the life and soul of the party. Well, it'd be a pretty dull party. But I mean, say, well, but John Hannah could do that. I couldn't. So I had to say that, well, how I have to do this is by just trying to sit down and talk to each one. And so I did that. and I was very glad I did it. And I went each year to Indonesia and did it. One year I was in a train going from Jakarta down to Purwokerto, and in the compartment was only one other person, and a European. So he guessed that I might be English speaking. So he said, how are you? And I could tell immediately, of course, he was a Dutchman. So we chatted on, and he was a Dutch Reform minister. And he said, what are you doing here? I said, he asked me, was I stationed? I said, no. And I explained to him that I was a provincial of the Oblates. And I said, I come up each year and I visit each place. And I said, my main thing is just talking individually to each oblate. Well, he was astounded. He said, if only somebody would come and talk to me. Isn't that interesting? He said, people will send me funds and anything I need, he said, but just to have somebody come and sit down and talk to me. So I thought, well, whatever I do, it's not entirely wasted. No. So whether I impressed the Oblates, anyway, I've impressed the Dutch Reformed Church.
Fair enough.
I can only be thankful for small mercies.
Certainly, I put in my diary to go to China twice a year. I can't even go to Mulgrave once a week, but that's okay. We'll change that eventually. So, what advice do you have to give to the current provincial and the next one?
Yeah, well, I don't know. Look, I think every time is different, isn't it? And every provincial has actually been faced with different challenges. You mentioned, the pedophile thing. I remember at the end of my time thinking, as I was reflecting on my time, in my 6 years, 6 oblates left. And that was an awful heart wrench, all of them people of, in their very active age. They're all in their 30s and 40s, all of them. They're all great contributors. They all could have, continued to do great things among the oblates, and they left. And I tried, I visited them and talked to them and all that sort of thing, and but still they left. And I remember thinking, well, any future provincial won't have to deal with the sort of things that I had to deal with, which just goes to show that paedophilia just didn't even, I just wouldn't have been a thing I thought of, I just thought that the worst could be people living one. We now know, of course, that there are far worse things that can happen. So it's very very easy to to say what people should be doing, but there are new challenges that come up, and we just have to face them as best we can. So
fair enough.
Yeah.
So Austin, you definitely have a unique position and vantage point, I think. You're a man who has lived faithfully your vocation for a long time, but also as an academic, first as a historian, then in the area of spirituality. While none of us have the ability to see in the future, unfortunately, because that's just not possible, but some of us are better placed than others to understand how to live in the present and move confidently into the future. So I was wondering, what do you see as the opportunities for the Australian province and the church at the present moment and moving into the future?
It's very hard to see that, isn't it? Look, I've just been immensely impressed. You invited me when you first came into office to talk to the youth group, And I just thought, look, there are so many of these very good young Catholics committed to the faith. I think that we've got to keep building those up, haven't we? And just hoping that somehow or other they can be 11. And I just think it's marvellous to think that there are people coming along who have great depth of faith, great enthusiasm, great vigour, and these are the sorts of things that we need to keep our mission going. It would be marvellous if some of them would join a group like ours. I think that we've got a wonderful tradition of ministry in all sorts of ways to enable people to preach the faith. And so I think there are great opportunities to do that. And so we can only hope and pray that some of these young people or people like them will think of joining a religious community or if they want to be priests, going to a diocese somewhere. There really is just so much to do, and I'm just amazed at some of the young priests around that I've taught, just how vigorous and enthusiastic they are. It's really great to see it. So there's great things there, great things to work on. We just wish there were a whole lot more, but, well, don't forget our Lord did great things with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Well, we've got some odd fish, so we might as well try to do what we can with what we've got. And not to lose heart, and not to be too fixed, I suppose, on numbers or the extent of the province. I think it'll probably continue to be a much smaller province than it was when I was provincial. With the Indonesian mission, we were nudging up towards the 100. We're a long way from the 100 now, aren't we?
Very much so.
But don't forget, St Joseph's, Sorrento, parish priest said we'd get a holiday when we got to 50. There are now something like 250 in the school. I don't know whether they got 5 free days.
We're a long way from a holiday here.
We are, but I mean, we don't know, do we,
No.
what's going to happen? And who knows, there might be the dawning of another age. We just don't know.
Yeah, it'd be interesting what effects this pandemic has also on people's faith.
Well, look, I was only reading yesterday in an Anglican newspaper, the Church Times, and I was reading about the present Archbishop of Canterbury, who said, just listing a few of the things that happened during the pandemic, the present Dean of Canterbury Cathedral sits in his garden of a day and leads morning prayer, and he has 40,000 followers. Now, these are people who probably never say morning prayer. Here's an old man sitting in a garden saying a very traditional prayer in antiquated English, probably, out of the Book of Common Prayer, and 40,000 people. We just don't know, do we? And so all sorts of areas around the Christian family, great things might be happening.
So any final comments or wisdom you'd like to share?
Oh, I wish I had something earth-shattering and something memorable and quotable. Look, I can't think, as I just feel, we just have to keep going with as much enthusiasm and vigour and good cheer as we can. And if I could just quote one of my favourite great writers, Julian of Norwich. Look, she lived in a very bleak time. A schism, 3 popes at one stage, heresy in England, a local bishop who was much more interested in being a soldier than a bishop. Everything was bleak, and yet she said, all will be well, all manner of things shall be well. We've got to keep up that gift of hope, which is one of the ingredients of faith.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Austin, for sitting down and sharing a little bit of wisdom and some of the journey and some of the history and some of the spirituality of your journey over the last 65 years and with it something of the Australian province and even the church here in Melbourne. I want to thank you on behalf of the Oblates for your amazing faithful service to the Oblates for 65 years and we know Ron Rolheiser always talks about the ageing process. He must be experiencing it himself, but he always talks about men can have a choice to be different, especially to the younger generation. And as you know, he's preached to us about being a blessing, and certainly you're a wonderful blessing to all of us younger priests. So thank you very much for being that blessing to me, living here at 649, not 62 to 94 Jackson's Road, but and being a blessing to all our province, but especially the young men, which are now becoming a majority in our province because of the change of demographics. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And hopefully quite a few more active years of ministry as well.
I look forward to that. Thanks, Christian.
God bless.